Pope Francis never expected his final message to spark a deadly chain of events. Just days before his death, he spoke cryptically of cleansing the darkness within, a warning that would set the stage for an explosive investigation. When his body is found under suspicious circumstances, a journalist risks everything to uncover the truth behind his death, revealing ties to a decades-old conspiracy that the Vatican will stop at nothing to keep hidden. Was Pope Francis murdered to silence him, or did he uncover a secret so dangerous it couldn't be allowed to surface?
Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, began life far from the marble halls of the Vatican. He was the son of Italian immigrants, growing up in a modest neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Argentina. As a young man, he trained as a chemist and briefly worked as a janitor to support his family. Few could have predicted that this quiet, soft-spoken man would one day lead the Catholic Church. But from an early age, Bergoglio was drawn to faith, entering the Jesuit order in his 20s and quickly gaining a reputation for humility, discipline, and a fierce commitment to the poor. As he rose through the ranks of the Church, Bergoglio never abandoned his devotion to simplicity. He chose to live in a small apartment instead of the Archbishop's palace, cooked his own meals, and rode the bus instead of using a driver. When he was elected Pope in 2013, he broke with centuries of tradition. He refused the opulent papal garments, declined to live in the apostolic palace, and took the name Francis after Saint Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of the poor. It was the first sign that his papacy would be unlike any other. But while the world embraced him as a symbol of humility and compassion, not everyone was celebrating. Inside the Vatican, a quiet resistance began to form. Francis pushed for reforms that angered many traditionalists. He spoke out against financial corruption, challenged political powers, and openly criticized the Church's handling of abuse cases. His decision to open the Vatican's secret archives to investigate cases long buried under bureaucracy and silence created waves of tension in the upper ranks of the Church. Many called him the People's Pope, but behind closed doors, others called him a threat. He was loved by the masses, but within the ancient walls of the Vatican, powerful figures began to worry. He questioned practices that had been untouchable for centuries and tried to dismantle systems that protected secrecy and control. While he presented a warm and open image to the world, his papacy was a battle behind the scenes, a war between light and shadow. And as that shadow grew darker, the man once seen as a symbol of hope became a marked figure in the most sacred and secretive city on earth. 5 days before his death, Pope Francis released a message that sent quiet ripples through the Vatican and beyond. It was brief, posted through an official channel, and read more like a reflection than a statement. But the words lingered in the minds of those who read them. The darkness within must be cleansed. Before the dawn, there must be silence. At first glance, many believed it to be a spiritual commentary, a poetic metaphor perhaps meant for Lent or Holy Week. Yet those close to the Pope knew it wasn't part of any scheduled message. It was unannounced, unsigned by any official communications team, and it went out in the early hours of the morning. The Vatican press office offered no explanation. When asked, one spokesperson said the Pope was simply in deep prayer and reflection. But internally, the message raised alarms. Some advisors questioned whether he had sent it himself. Others, more unsettled, asked what he meant by darkness within. Was it a personal confession, a warning, or something else entirely? Behind the Vatican walls, speculation grew. Security measures around the Pope were discreetly tightened. Certain individuals were denied access to his private chambers. Internal meetings became more frequent but less transparent. Even senior cardinals found themselves suddenly excluded from gatherings they had long attended. No explanations were given. For months leading up to this, Francis had been unusually reserved. Those closest to him noted a shift. He had grown quieter, more contemplative, and occasionally distracted. One aide recalled finding him awake at 3 a.m., pacing the halls outside the chapel, holding a sealed envelope. When asked if everything was all right, the Pope reportedly only said, "Some truths need time." The cryptic message was not the first unusual event. but it was the most public. That one sentence would become the focal point of countless theories after his death. Some believed it hinted at spiritual warfare within the church. Others suspected it referenced a specific individual or group operating in the shadows. A few suggested it was a farewell of sorts, cloaked in metaphor to bypass censorship or surveillance. What no one could deny was the unease it stirred. In a place where every word is measured, such ambiguity felt deliberate, as if Pope Francis was leaving a clue, knowing that time was running out and silence was closing in. On the morning of April 21, 2025, the Vatican issued a brief statement. Pope Francis had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88. The announcement was simple, almost sterile, noting natural causes as the reason for death. Tributes poured in from world leaders, religious figures, and millions of ordinary people. The world mourned a spiritual giant. But within the Vatican, a very different story was beginning to take shape. Sources later revealed that it wasn't a doctor who first found the Pope, but a young priest assigned to the early morning duties in the papal residence. What he saw reportedly left him shaken. The Pope's body was lying on the floor beside his bed, not in it. His arms were crossed over his chest, and there was a thin line of blood beneath his nose. An overturned glass of water was found near his hand. There were bruises along the knuckles of his right hand, something not mentioned in the official report. Within hours, the area was sealed off. The priest who found the body was reassigned and ordered to observe a period of silence. The Vatican press office was given strict instructions. No mention of any irregularities, no deviation from the narrative. The cause of death would be listed as cardiac arrest due to age-related health issues. Then came the leak. Days later, 2 grainy photos appeared on an encrypted message board frequented by investigative journalists. They were crude, but real, images of the Pope's body on an autopsy table. One showed visible abrasions on his wrist. Another revealed dark marks on the side of his neck. No official ever confirmed or denied the authenticity of the images. But within hours, the Vatican's cybersecurity division attempted to have the images wiped from the web. The questions came fast. Why was there no official autopsy conducted by an independent medical examiner? Why had the security footage from the night of his death not been released or even acknowledged? And why had key members of his personal staff been reassigned or sent away immediately afterward? To the public, Pope Francis had died peacefully. But to those paying closer attention, the details painted a different picture. One filled with inconsistencies, silence, and quiet removals of anyone who might have known too much. His death certificate offered closure. But the scene of his death whispered something else entirely. Clara Rossi was not the type to chase wild conspiracies. She was known for her sharp, fact-driven reporting and had built her career exposing hidden truths within powerful institutions. When news of Pope Francis's death broke, she was preparing to leave journalism behind after a long and exhausting investigation into missing Vatican assets. But something about the Pope's final message and the eerie silence that followed, his death, caught her attention. Then came the message that changed everything. A single line sent anonymously to her encrypted email. "They're burying more than a body." Intrigued and unsettled, Clara began asking questions. She contacted sources she hadn't spoken to in years, former Swiss guards, retired cardinals, and even nuns who had worked in the apostolic palace. Some refused to speak. Others warned her to leave it alone. But a few, in hushed voices and under false names, began to share pieces of a much larger puzzle. There were rumors of a secret investigation the Pope had ordered in his final year, one that targeted financial irregularities and historical abuses that had never been publicly addressed. Clara quickly realized that official channels were a dead end. Emails went unanswered, Vatican spokespeople gave generic responses, and every request for information about the Pope's last days was deflected. So, she began collecting fragments, internal memos, budget drafts, and transcripts from Vatican meetings quietly leaked by sympathetic insiders. A pattern began to form, one connecting Pope Francis's hidden efforts to reform the Vatican's finances to a decades-old mystery involving a young girl who vanished without a trace. Her investigation led her to a dusty archive in Milan, where, She discovered references to Project EO83, a code that would appear again and again in classified church documents. The deeper she dug, the more connections she found between high-ranking clergy and shell companies used to move large sums of money offshore. She found names, dates, even travel records that lined up too perfectly to ignore. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous her search became. Her phone was tapped. She spotted the same black car parked outside her apartment for 3 consecutive nights. One of her sources went missing days after speaking with her. Clara knew she had stumbled into something that reached far beyond a natural death, and as she pieced together the Pope's final movements, she began to see a chilling truth unfold. He had been closing in on something others would kill to keep hidden. Clara's investigation into the Pope's death soon veered into darker, more dangerous territory as she began to uncover disturbing details about Vatican finances. In the months leading up to his death, Pope Francis had quietly initiated an extensive audit of the Vatican's financial dealings, something that hadn't been attempted in decades. He had appointed a team of independent financial experts to scour through the Church's vast portfolio, hoping to uncover hidden accounts, offshore investments, and illicit transactions that had long remained concealed. It wasn't just a matter of cleaning up the Church's image. Francis had found something that deeply disturbed him. The more Clara read through the documents, the clearer it became. The Vatican's financial dealings were not only murky, but intricately tied to a web of corruption and criminal activity. Large sums of money had been funneled through shell companies and secretive accounts across Europe and the Caribbean. Some of the funds had been used to buy luxury properties in prime locations, while others seemed to vanish into the hands of high-ranking church officials who had no visible means of income. The audit revealed that over $2 billion in assets had been misplaced or hidden, funds meant for charity, meant for the poor, but instead siphoned off by powerful figures within the church. But there was more. Clara discovered that many of the transactions had been connected to a shadowy network of individuals with ties to organized crime syndicates in Italy and beyond. These were not the typical financial dealings of a religious institution. They were the covert machinations of a group protecting its wealth and influence at all costs. The names of prominent cardinals and bishops began to appear in the documents, many of whom had been in the inner circles of Vatican power for decades. The Pope's team had only just begun their work when he died. Clara found evidence that Francis had become obsessed with uncovering the full extent of the corruption. He had been making plans to confront these powerful figures, to expose their ties to illegal activities. One memo, dated only a few weeks before his death, stated that the Pope had discovered deep connections between the Vatican's financial network and a criminal syndicate that stretched far beyond Italy, reaching into the highest echelons of international business and politics. What was most chilling, however, was a note in the margin of a financial report. The girl. Clara had heard rumors of the mysterious disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi, the 15-year-old girl who vanished from Vatican City in 1983, but never connected it to the financial corruption. As she dug further into the Vatican's archives, Clara uncovered records that linked Emanuela's case to the same dark financial networks the Pope had been investigating. The deeper Clara delved, the more she realized how far-reaching this web of corruption truly was. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the protection of secrets that could bring down some of the most influential figures in the church. And as she continued to unearth these connections, Clara knew she was walking a dangerous path, one that might cost her more than just her career. She had uncovered a conspiracy of such magnitude that even Pope Francis had paid the ultimate price for it. Clara's discovery of the connection between the missing Vatican funds and the 1983 disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard the name countless times in her career, but like most journalists, she had always treated it as one of those unresolved mysteries that would never be solved. The case of Emanuela, the young Vatican City resident who vanished without a trace, had captivated the world for decades. The official story was that she had been abducted, but the Vatican had always been tight-lipped, and countless theories had sprouted, from mafia involvement to secretive papal intrigues. But Clara's investigation revealed something far more sinister. The Pope had been quietly revisiting the case in his final months. As she pieced together fragments of secret Vatican documents and private memos, Clara found a chilling pattern. There were references to a file labeled EO83, a code name that had been used for years in Vatican records but had never been fully explained. The file contained details about the investigation into Emanuela's disappearance, as well as connections to powerful figures within the Vatican itself. It seemed that Emanuela had been more than just an innocent victim in a random kidnapping. According to the documents Clara uncovered, her disappearance was directly linked to a vast, covert operation involving Vatican finances. Emanuela had been inadvertently caught in the middle of a financial scandal that involved vast sums of money being funneled through the church into offshore accounts, some of which were connected to criminal organizations operating in Italy and abroad. The more Clara dug, the clearer it became. Emanuela had known too much. In the final days of her life, she had begun asking questions that might have exposed the financial corruption the Pope was now investigating. Some of the leaked documents even suggested that Emanuela had uncovered financial discrepancies within the Vatican's investment arm and had been preparing to reveal them. Clara found a series of coded messages in the files that pointed to a series of meetings between Vatican officials and shady businessmen, some of whom were tied to the Orlandi family. These men were powerful enough to silence anyone, and they had clearly done so before. Clara's heart raced as she connected the dots. Pope Francis's decision to reopen the Orlandi case wasn't simply a moral or spiritual gesture. It was a tactical move to understand the full scope of the Church's entanglement with organized crime. The Pope had been preparing to expose these connections, and Emanuela's fate had been the key. Clara could only imagine the pressure Pope Francis must have felt as he uncovered the tangled web of corruption, not only in the Vatican but across Italy and beyond. The further Clara ventured into this conspiracy, the more dangerous it became. People around her began to grow wary. One of her sources, a former high-ranking Vatican official, told her bluntly, "You're poking at something that has never been meant to see the light." It was clear to Clara that she was now in a race against time. If she didn't uncover the truth soon, she might find herself sharing the same fate as those who had tried to expose the darkness before her. As Clara continued her investigation into the Vatican's darkest secrets, she began to realize that her every move was being watched. At first, it was subtle. An unfamiliar car parked near her apartment, a fleeting shadow passing by as she walked through the streets of Rome. But soon, the surveillance became more overt. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number calling her multiple times a day, then hanging up before she could answer. A sense of paranoia settled over her like a heavy fog. One evening, she returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, but everything appeared untouched. The feeling of intrusion, though, lingered. It was clear now that someone knew what she was uncovering, someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Clara's sources, once eager to provide information, began to pull back. One of the Swiss guards who had been providing her with insights about the Pope's final days called her from a hidden number, his voice urgent but trembling. "You need to stop," he warned. "The people you're digging into, they're dangerous. The Pope found something they'll kill to keep buried. They've already started watching you." The phone call was abruptly cut off, and Clara never heard from him again. Her investigation into the hidden Vatican finances had unearthed not just money, but a dangerous underworld of connections between powerful church officials and international criminal organizations. What she had assumed were isolated corruption scandals now appeared to be part of a much larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the walls of the Vatican. It seemed that the Pope had been closing in on something that could unravel the YUO Church's financial empire. But who would go so far as to silence him? Desperate for answers, Clara sought out a former Vatican insider, a priest who had once been part of the Pope's inner circle. He agreed to meet in a remote location under the cover of darkness. When Clara arrived, the priest handed her a battered envelope, marked with the words, "For your eyes only." Inside, she found a disturbing letter, handwritten by the Pope himself. In it, Francis had detailed his growing fear that he was being watched by individuals with ties to the very corruption he was trying to expose. He had written of his suspicions about certain high-ranking cardinals and even hinted at the possibility of betrayal from within the Vatican's own security forces. The letter also referenced something else, something more chilling. A secret meeting had taken place in the days before the Pope's death, one that Clara believed might hold the key to understanding his final days. The Pope had met with several trusted advisors, discussing the future of the investigation and the need for discretion. The letter ended with a stark warning. "If I die before this is exposed, it will mean the end of everything." Clara now knew that she wasn't just up against corruption. She was up against a network of powerful individuals with everything to lose. As she read the letter, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had always suspected that the Pope's death wasn't natural, but now, with this evidence in hand, she realized just how deep the conspiracy went. Someone wanted the Pope's investigation to end, and they had made sure it did, permanently. But Clara couldn't stop now. She had to find out who was behind this, no matter what the cost. Clara's resolve hardened as she read the Pope's letter, but with it came a wave of dread. She knew that uncovering the truth now would be dangerous, not just for her, but for everyone who had helped her along the way. The Vatican's secrecy was vast, and the people protecting its darkest secrets were not to be underestimated. But Clara couldn't turn back. She had seen the web, and the more she saw, the more she understood that the death of Pope Francis wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger. The Pope's letter left her with a cryptic clue. Follow the money to find the truth. It was a simple directive, but it gave her direction. She had already unearthed the links between Vatican finances and international criminal syndicates, but there was something deeper beneath the surface. Clara believed that the Pope had stumbled upon a secret that wasn't just about corruption, it was about control. The Vatican's finances were used to fund more than just charitable works. They were the lifeblood of a hidden empire that spanned continents, manipulating governments, businesses, and even the underworld. Clara knew that in order to get to the heart of the conspiracy, she had to go further than the Vatican itself. She started looking into the international banks that had been used to launder Vatican funds. After weeks of digging, Clara uncovered records that led her to a high-profile financial institution based in Switzerland. The records were encrypted, but Clara had access to a hacker who could help her break through the security. It wasn't long before she had uncovered a series of transactions that were not only illegal, but also connected to some of the most powerful individuals in the world. These transactions involved offshore accounts linked to both Vatican figures and political leaders across Europe and the Middle East. The more Clara connected the dots, the more chilling the story became. The financial dealings weren't just for power or wealth. They were linked to covert operations, arms deals, illicit oil trading, even trafficking. Pope Francis had been on the cusp of exposing an international syndicate that used the Vatican's money as a cover for a much darker agenda. The Pope's efforts to reform the Vatican's finances had brought him dangerously close to unraveling a global network of corruption and violence that reached beyond anything she could have imagined. Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of the stakes pressing down on her. She had already lost her sources. People who had once trusted her now feared her. She was being hunted, and the deeper she went, the closer the danger crept. She had to act quickly. There were only so many people she could trust, and the walls were closing in. If she could expose the connections between the Vatican, the criminal syndicates, and the missing Pope, it could bring down not just a few corrupt individuals, but an entire empire built on secrecy and power. But she was running out of time. The more Clara uncovered, the more she realized that those who had killed the Pope wouldn't stop at her. They were willing to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the truth. She had to find a way to leak the information before it was too late. Clara's investigation had now reached a critical juncture. Every lead she followed seemed to deepen the mystery of Pope Francis's death, but also increased the danger she faced. The walls around her were closing in. The Vatican, through its vast network of influence, had been relentless in trying to silence her. She had been followed, her communications intercepted, and sources, once eager to help, had begun to disappear. Clara knew that the longer she stayed in Rome, the more likely she would become the next target. But there was still one lead left, a secret meeting that the Pope had allegedly arranged just days before his death. According to a leaked memo, the meeting had been scheduled with a select few high-ranking officials, both inside the Vatican and outside it, to discuss the fate of the investigation into the Church's finances. The names of those involved were redacted, but Clara knew she had to get her hands on those names. It was the key to understanding the final moments of Pope Francis's life. She made contact with an old colleague, Marco, who had been a reporter for the Italian press, but had long since retired after a scandal involving leaked Vatican documents. Marco had connections within the Catholic world, some of them still willing to speak to him in confidence. He agreed to help Clara, but only under the condition that they meet in an isolated location, a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of Rome. It was there that Marco handed her a small, unmarked envelope. Inside was a series of documents, meeting, minutes from the secret Vatican gathering, along with a list of names that made Clara's blood run cold. Several of the names were familiar, powerful cardinals and bishops who had long held sway within the Vatican. But there were others, ones she hadn't expected. Business tycoons with ties to the criminal world, politicians with connections to arms dealers, even members of European intelligence agencies. The group was an intricate web of power, each individual bound by a mutual interest, maintaining control over the Vatican's vast financial empire and protecting the dark secrets that were buried within it. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the documents. Pope Francis had known he was stepping into dangerous waters by opening the investigation. But now, it was clear. He had underestimated the lengths to which these individuals would go to protect their interests. The meeting, Clara surmised, was the final attempt by these figures to broker a deal, to either bring the Pope into compliance or silence him once and for all. One name on the list stood out, Cardinal Sergio De Luca, a man who had been a trusted ally of Pope Francis for years. His name had appeared frequently in the financial documents Clara had uncovered, but she had never connected him directly to the conspiracy. It seemed De Luca had played a pivotal role in the Vatican's financial operations, often acting as a middleman between church officials and external power players. His role in the secret meeting was undeniable. Was De Luca a part of the plot to remove the Pope? Was he the one who had ultimately sealed Francis's fate? Clara had the pieces of the puzzle in front of her, but she needed proof. Proof that would convince the world, that would bring down the corrupt empire that had protected these men for so long. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She had to get this information out, and fast. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the stakes. If she didn't act soon, the truth would remain buried with the Pope, and the corruption within the Vatican would continue unchecked, with devastating consequences for the Church and the world. The next move was critical. Clara had to decide who she could trust, and how she could expose the conspiracy without becoming its next victim. The clock was ticking. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity for Clara. She knew that every decision she made now could be her last. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. The conspiracy within the Vatican was more vast and powerful than she had ever imagined, and the forces working to keep the truth hidden were not going to stop. Clara had uncovered too much for them to let her walk away unscathed. But she was determined to bring it all to light, no matter the cost. The information she had collected over the past few weeks, the documents, the recordings, the eyewitness testimonies, was the kind of evidence that could bring down the Vatican's corrupt financial empire, but it wasn't enough to just have it. She needed a platform, a way to make the world see what she had uncovered. Clara reached out to the one journalist she trusted completely, Alex Mercer, an investigative reporter with a reputation for exposing global corruption, no matter how high the stakes. She knew that if anyone could help her get the story out, it was Alex. She shared everything, every document, every detail of her investigation, every name. Alex listened carefully, his voice grim as he pieced together the connections. They both knew that once the world learned what Clara had found, there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Clara had to go into hiding. She knew the people behind this conspiracy were closing in on her. One evening, she was followed by a black car she recognized from earlier weeks, and it was enough to confirm her suspicions. They were tracking her every move. Alex promised to handle everything from there. He had contacts in the media who could publish her story anonymously and securely. A week later, the world was shaken. Alex Mercer's exposé dropped on multiple platforms, revealing the Pope's final investigation and the deadly corruption he had uncovered. It detailed the ties between high-ranking Vatican officials, international criminals, and governments, unmasking the network that had controlled the Church's finances for decades. The article also published photos of the Pope's death scene, along with leaked memos and financial records that proved he had been murdered to prevent him from exposing them. The impact was immediate. There were protests in the streets of Rome, and calls for an independent investigation into the Pope's death. The Vatican issued a statement claiming the article was filled with lies and fabrications, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and the world wasn't going to ignore it. For Clara, there was no triumph in the revelation. She had succeeded, but at a great personal cost. Her name was now known across the world, but she had to live in the shadows, constantly, moving to avoid detection. She had lost her career, her safety, and her peace of mind. But what mattered was that the Pope's death, once ruled a natural passing, had been recognized for what it truly was: a murder that was part of a cover-up, decades in the making.